Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in direction of Vuhledar, where we see that the Russians have managed to capture a series of the high-rise buildings in the eastern parts of Vuhledar, gaining full control of it. So we see the eastern parts is now under Russian control, the southern parts and the northwestern parts remain under Ukrainian control, and the outskirts remain under Ukrainian control. The Russians have also expanded to some of the garages here in the northern parts of the city, and this has allowed them to physically cut off the remaining road in and out of Vuhledar here in the central parts of the city. The Ukrainians continue their attempts to withdraw from the city as they continue sending units from the southern parts here near the front line towards the outskirts of Vuhledar, then through the city to the escape. Now that the Russians have cut off another escape route, there's only one single road that remains, and that is through the open fields in between the two forest lines here in the northwestern parts of Vuhledar, where they'll simply go off-road and then into the road here later up. This means that as long as the battle continues in this good weather that we've been seeing, which is seen to continue, the Ukrainians can continue just moving through the fields to escape. The Russians are already present here in the northwest. If they continue pushing just a bit more, then Vuhledar will be physically cut off from any escape route. It is already under Russian fire control considering the close proximity. There is some trace that is going to be covering for the infantry, but with just a single drone you can see the whole area at all times. Therefore, it is likely that any soldiers will be under heavy fire as soon as they leave the city. Based on the current trend, it has become obvious that the Russians will be capturing the city as long as no Ukrainian counterattack takes place, and any such counterattack will be very difficult to pull off, as you'll have to cross through large spans of open fields, which is now under constant Russian surveillance, which means that no such offensive will come unnoticed and it will be under heavy fire as soon as they appear. The Russians have prepared a lot of artillery units in the area for this offensive, and that means that they have enough units to hold back any potential Ukrainian offensive, and it is simply too costly to launch a counterattack at this point, which means that it is likely that the Russians will simply continue their offensive until they gain full control over the city, and that will lead to the Russians storming the next positions of Vuhledar and Novokrenka in the section of the front line, and with the recent advance here northeast of Vuhledar from Vuhledar towards Katerinivka, it has also become more likely that the Russians will expand towards Katerinivka and this general conglomerate of several towns along the river line between Konstantinivka in the east and Uspinivka in the west. So we see that the Russians will be launching offensive operations across the entire section of the front line following the capture of Vuhledar. If it was the summer of 2022, then the Russians would take an operational pause following the capture of Vuhledar. However, this situation has completely changed, and I recently read some information about how this combat structure works, because we have a large number of Russian soldiers in this general area. Yet only a few of these soldiers are fighting at the front line. How does this work? This video here explains it really well in terms of ancient Roman warfare. However, it can still be applied to today. What we see is that there are some frontline units that are fighting at a constant pace. In this case, it is the 72nd Mechanized Brigade for the Ukrainians. These soldiers number about 2,000. These soldiers are constantly fighting near the front line because they cannot withdraw to the rear. The Russian soldiers, however, are the ones on the offensive, and they have operationally encircled the Ukrainians, removing any possibility of the Ukrainians rotating, but instead the Russians can constantly rotate. This means that this portion here can be any of the brigades or regiments that the Russians are fighting with near Vuhledar. They fight as soon as they get tired, exhausted, or they lose combat readiness. They will withdraw and be replaced by a different unit. And this is why the Russian offensive is succeeding. They prevent the Ukrainians from doing this rotation while they themselves can. This means that they can regularly rotate units in and out so that as soon as you can fight for a day, then you're rotated out for the next unit. This is why when we look at the map, we can see that the Russians made an advance and then this advance stopped. It is likely because it is rotating one company out with another company from the same brigade. This means that the next company will launch the next attack. This is to prevent some units from being exhausted. And this is exactly why they do not need any more operational pauses, because they simply do not get that tired. Previously, in the summer of 2022, when the Russians captured Lysychansk, they had the same units constantly be fighting, and they had been fighting for a long time. They simply did not have enough units to rotate the exhausted one out and replace them with fresh troops. However, now that they have recruited hundreds of thousands of troops, they have now become to a position where they can constantly fight because the units are simply constantly rotated in and out by new fresh units. So all units get combat experience, all units are not tired because as soon as they do, they get rotated out. And by rotated out, I don't mean that they go back all the way to Russia to hold a vacation. I simply mean they go back to Yehorivka or some of the rear villages and towns, or even just down to Pavlivka or Shevchenkova, near the front line, where they will rest for a couple of days and then they may be rotated in again. The point is that they don't get exhausted and they only fight for the amount of time that they are ready to be fighting in. And as soon as they aren't combat ready, they withdraw, refresh, and then back in again. And this has allowed the Russians to continue the Pokrovsk offensive for a very long time, because they simply have enough troops to constantly rotate out the exhausted ones, and then they continue the offensive operations. What we saw following the capture of Novhrodivka is that the Russians committed to one of such rotations. But instead of just companies rotating out with one another, it is brigades or a division that rotated out with other brigades or divisions. This takes much longer time, and therefore the Ukrainians took that advantage to push some of the Russian positions back and launched some counterattack while the Russians were rotating, and this allowed the Ukrainians to recapture some of the positions near Novhrodivka. But now that the rotation has finished, the Russians have restarted their offensive operations and are retaking more positions here near Novhrodivka and towards Mirnorod. And this is exactly why it is completely delusional when experts claim that the Russians cannot continue this offensive operation here near Pokrovsk. They will eventually lose steam, they will slow down because their soldiers are exhausted. No, they simply have enough soldiers to continue fighting continuously. And this is my exact point about the sustainability of the Russian army. The Ukrainians are fighting at a much more fully committed rate, where a lot more units are sent to the front, more than they can constantly rotate out. This means that the Ukrainian units get tired and exhausted fairly quickly, while the Russians are fighting at a very sustainable rate, where they can continuously output the same amount of strength as they have been doing. And this is why as soon as the Ukrainian lines weaken, they speed up. But this also means that this is not the max capacity, because they can choose to commit more forces, which makes it less sustainable, but allows them to launch larger offensives and stronger offensives at a higher rate. Looking back at this video, we can explain it through this video, and this is a very good video. I definitely recommend watching it, and the sister video to this video, as he has made 2 of them. Here we can see that both sides of the battle have a lot of units at the front line fighting, then they have the rear guard, and then they have reserves. This is true for both sides. Now, if the Russians are committing a lot of forces to one section of the front line where they have 7 lines, and the Ukrainians instead sent their reserves out of this section of the front line to fight in Kursk, suddenly it is 7-3, and that is a significant manpower advantage that is not instantly seen, because the Ukrainians have enough forces to spread across the entire front line, but they only have fewer lines compared to what they would have if their reserves weren't in Kursk. This means that the Russians will continue to pressure and rotate out their forces. The Ukrainians will do the same, but they have fewer soldiers to rotate it out with. This means that they will eventually end up exhausted, and that is when the Russians introduce their reserves to strengthen their push, and a stronger offensive will take place. However, it is believed that the Russians simply will not introduce their reserves yet. I believe that the current situation is that the Ukrainians will continue fighting heavily over Pokrovsk. They still have 3 or 4 lines. This means that they still have a lot of forces to rotate it in and out. The Russians want to launch an offensive when they believe they can break through all 4 of those lines and go beyond it. Because, as is also explained in the same video, in historical battles in the Roman times, when the frontline positions were clashing, both sides only ended up with a casualty rate of about 5%. But if one army was routed, that would go all the way up to about 60% casualty rates. This means that what the Russians would be aiming for is that the Ukrainians will be broken through and routed, and that will allow the Russians to inflict heavy casualties on the Ukrainians and capture large heaps of territory. However, that is not possible without breaking through all 4 of those lines. Therefore, they are waiting, because if the Ukrainians have 3 lines here, the Russians break through the first one and the second one, but not the third one. That means that the Ukrainians can re-establish new lines and rotate out or spread across to fill in the gaps and re-establish their front line. This is the exact example of what the Ukrainians succeeded with their Kursk offensive. The Russians had several lines of defense. The Ukrainians, what they would do is that they would start fighting one of these lines of defense, find a gap, and take advantage of that to fight the next line of defense, and keep doing this until they reach the end of the Russian lines, where they were forced to stop and fight because they simply could not go beyond. And that allowed the Russians to re-establish the front line by securing some of these gaps one by one, and this has allowed the Russians to stabilize their front after weeks of constant Ukrainian advances, where they would capture 50 kilometers a day, 100 square kilometers a day. But with these lines that simply were too many for the Ukrainians to break through all of them, they could not make a large breakthrough. And that is exactly why the Russians want to delay their offensive. And this is exactly why anyone saying that, well, the Russians have made such a much larger army, they have so much more artillery, they have so much more of everything, but they are not capable to launch an offensive, is simply either delusional or does not know about military strategy, tactics, or anything else regarding to military operations. Because what the Russians are doing is that they're wiping out the Ukrainian reserves or even their rear guard to launch an operation. Because what is apparent is the losses in the front line, not the losses in the rear. This is because these losses just keep on refilling. They just keep sending new troops to the front line. So it is not apparent at the front line that the Ukrainians are suffering heavy losses. If they are, due to the fact that they can just send in new forces to the front. But if they lose enough forces, they'll eventually not have enough to send to the front, and that is when the Russian offensive speeds up, even if they aren't trying to, and that is exactly what we've seen in the Pokrovsk section of the front line. We've seen that the Ukrainian losses were too high to be replaced, and the Russian offensive operations simply sped up. Now, if the Ukrainian lines were much stronger a year ago than they were now, then a Russian offensive a year ago would definitely have failed. But now that they have significantly weakened, the possibility of a successful Russian offensive has increased significantly. And if the Russians continue like this, the longer they continue like this, grinding down the Ukrainian army at a higher rate, higher pace, then the Ukrainians can regenerate their army, remobilize new forces, and so on, then they will eventually be reaching a breaking point where the Ukrainians do not have any forces in reserves, and the Russians can simply walk through the Ukrainian defenses without any resistance. And that is the sort of operation that the Russians are attempting to go at. Meanwhile, what I believe the Ukrainians are planning, the Zelensky peace plan or victory plan, I believe that is to gather enough forces in the reserves, concentrate them at one point, break through the Russian lines to make the Russians go into a rout, and that could change the situation completely. The Ukrainians are more of a gambler, where they attempt to bet it all in to try and get the big jackpot, while the Russians are simply doing the daily work to grind down and increase their odds before they attempt any such large operation. And if you think about it this way, then the Ukrainian Kursk offensive makes a lot of sense. Now back to the frontline changes, we see that the Russians expanded slightly here north of Sukharine, along the railway towards the southern flank of Seledovo, and they also managed to capture Krasny Yar following the Ukrainian recapture of it. They also managed to capture the majority of Mykolaiivka, the eastern parts of it, as well as the fortified positions to the north of it, as we see with this geolocated footage here. Further north, the Russians have managed to capture parts of Ryorivka, the eastern parts of it, both the entrance and pushing into the northern and western parts of the town as we continue offensive operations in the northern flank of Bakhmut. The Russians have also managed to advance within Makiivka in the northern parts of it, capturing that part as well. This means that the only parts remaining under Ukrainian control is this small area here in the central parts and the western part of Makiivka, and this separate part south of Makiivka. The rest of it is now under Russian control, and this was also confirmed with this geolocated footage. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Let me know what you think about this fight analysis I did based on the video, and make sure to check it out as it really helped me out a lot with the visualization of explaining exactly how these battles take place. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.